Good afternoon. Again, welcome to the second hour of the Teach-In on Human Rights. We are particularly pleased to have a panel of distinguished historians who will be introduced to you in a moment by Mark Bradley. On behalf of the Human Rights Program, I would like to extend a special thank you to Professor of History and Dean of the College, John Boyer, whose support of our program in many ways has assured its survival, prosperity, and continuity over the last 10 years of its existence, and we look forward to his remaining dean for many years because he has really been a very important supporter of our work. The historians at the University of Chicago are developing a very special sensibility and reputation among human rights scholars. While our program is, as Michael Geyer pointed out, broadly interdisciplinary, we find that we have at this point in time a tremendous amount of depth in the Department of History, some of which will be displayed today. And this role of the University of Chicago Department of History in faculty research and teaching in human rights also has extended itself beyond this university. We have found that a number of people who receive their PhDs in history here have gone on to teach human rights and history courses at universities and colleges across the country. So the Chicago Department of History is not only distinguished in terms of the scholarship of its members, but also its capacity to spread the teaching of human rights in the liberal arts across the country. So I guess it's somewhat subversive in that way and a development that we applaud, welcome, and support. So without further ado, Mark Bradley will introduce the panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Susan. John probably won't appreciate this comment, but if you think about what we classically think of as the Chicago boys and maybe some of the human rights issues that emerged in that discourse, the notion that we now have human rights boys and girls in history going out and doing something different is a kind of nice notion. We're trying to take things from the very universal and bring them down to the more particular for this second hour of the teach-in, thinking about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in an American context, but also in a more specifically Chicago context, and even more specifically than that, a University of Chicago context. I'm delighted that three of my colleagues are able to be here to join us to get that set of discussions going. First, John Boyer, as Susan was mentioning, the Dean of the College, talking about Robert Maynard Hutchins and the traditions of academic freedom at the University of Chicago. Then Jane Daly will be talking to us a little bit about issues of race, marriage, and sovereignty after the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And then finally, Jim Sparrow, a brief talk entitled Entangling Alliances, Realism versus Idealism in the Early Cold War Period. So, John, if you can get us started.
Thank you very much, Mark. My remarks are have to do with academic freedom and the practice of rights at the University of Chicago. Universities are institutionally bounded communities in our culture that depend upon a robust practice of rights. The faculty, as the intellectual leaders of these communities, presume a wide latitude of free professional agency to be exercised without punitive consequences, to teach and to publish what they want, when they want it, in a format that is convenient to them. But more than this, the faculty presume that they have the full force of individual rights to speak as private citizens, to use their professional identities and reputations to lend their voices a certain level of expertise and credibility, however controversial or unpopular their views might be at the moment. As foundations or endowments that both require and defend bundles of rights, universities have a powerful role in our society in defending a broader exercise of rights, however such rights might be conceived or defined. Excuse me. Over the course of the 20th century, the capacity of individual faculty members to be able to enjoy such protections was hard fought and slowly won. Nowadays, most faculty routinely presume that they may teach their special subjects and areas of expertise in ways that makes the most sense to them, and our students share these assumptions, for the university does not regulate student speech, and our institutional structures are designed to reflect these values. The University of Chicago had much to do with the defining and practicing of a rhetoric of educational rights before and after 1945, and much of this activity was centered in or around our fifth president, Robert Maynard Hutchins, who served from 1929 to 1951. In the middle third of the 20th century, the university, during Hutchins' presidency, was the scene of several controversies involving the articulation of faculty and student rights, And I'd like to discuss 3 such episodes today very, very briefly, and conclude with a 4th comment on a possible linkage to the Universal Declaration via Richard McKeon. In early 1935, the University of Chicago found itself on a list released in a national radio address by Congressman Hamilton Fish of New York State, purporting that the communists had infiltrated Chicago along with other leading universities. President Hutchins responded to Fish's accusations in an eloquent speech on February 21st, 1935, at the annual dinner of Chicago area alumni that was held at the Union League Club. Hutchins argued forcefully that, quote, a university, if it is one, is seeking for truth. Are we to say that it should seek the truth only of those matters which have no bearing on our daily lives? The free and independent exercise of the intelligence is the means by which the truth may be discovered. The answers to such charges against a university is not denial, nor evasion, nor apology. It is the assertion that free inquiry is indispensable to the good life, that universities exist for the sake of such inquiry, and that without it, they would cease to be universities, and that such inquiry, and hence universities, are all the more necessary now than ever. The sacred trust of the universities, Hutchins concluded, is to carry the torch of freedom. 2 months later, in April of 1935, the owner of a national chain of drugstores headquartered in Chicago, Charles Walgreens, wrote to Robert Hutchins informing him that he was withdrawing his niece, her name was Lucille Norton, from the university because she had been insidiously exposed to, quote, communistic influences, unquote. Walgreens further asked why one of our country's leading universities should permit, even to a limited degree, seditious propaganda under the guise of academic freedom. Within 24 hours, copies of Walgreens Letter had found their way to the editorial offices of all the newspapers, especially the Hearst Press in Chicago, the Herald, Examiner, and the American. This became front-page news with large headlines screaming, Walgreens takes niece from the University of Chicago to avoid communistic influences, followed by the next day by Walgreens demands the UC prove red influences at an open inquiry. Hutchins refused to agree to such an inquiry, and this led a group of conservative Republican state senators in Springfield, Illinois, to take the matters in their own hands. They passed a resolution on April 17th, submitted by Senator Charles Baker of Monroe Center, Illinois, constituting a special committee to investigate subversive communist teachings and ideas advocating the overthrow of the established form of the government of the United States, and decided then to use that mandate to investigate the University of Chicago. There were a number of hearings over several days. The low point of these hearings came in the testimony of one Harry A. Jung, who was a local fascist thug and the founder of the American Vigilant Intelligence Federation, and a lady by the name of Elizabeth Dilling, whose publicity handouts, and she had them, described her as a modern Joan of Arc of Kenilworth, Illinois. Dilling, a self-appointed crusader against world communism, presented the committee with a 102-page pamphlet called How Red is the University of Chicago, and told the committee, quote, I devote my entire life and time to the study of the communist socialist movement and fighting against it by writing and lecturing because I would rather be dead than to see its principles triumph in the United States. Quote, unquote. Reading a long list of random references, which she alleged demonstrated the university was a hotbed of communism, she then proceeded to denounce Hutchins, along with Walter Del Scott, who was the president of Northwestern, Senator William Borah, Louis D. Brandeis, Ambassador William Dodd, John Dewey, the chairman of our board of trustees, Harold Swift, and Jane Addams, as communist sympathizers. Of Harold Swift, she said, quote, now there is a cream puff type who would have his throat cut if this communism were put over. You know, Senator, it takes the second generation of millionaires. They like to play with communism. You know, Senator, some of our rich men turn to booze, some to chorus girls, and some like to play with revolution. Something theoretical. Unquote. Dilling was convinced that it's certain that the University of Chicago is diseased with communism and its contagion is a menace to the community and the nation. Comic relief, there was even more, and it came in the form of fisticuffs when one board audience member leaned over to a gentleman next to him and asked if Mrs. Dilling should not be more properly or accurately named Mrs. Dillinger, whereupon the second man, who turned out to be her husband, punched the first in the nose. Now, for all of their turbulence and humor, the Walgreens hearings elicited enormous support from faculty and students on campus. Faculty did teach-in, actually, not unlike the one we're doing today. In early 1935, on the issue of academic freedom, the students gathered petitions, interesting collection of the editor of the Chicago Maroon, the captain of the football team, and the president of the Interfraternity Council, I mean, this really was a University of Chicago project, wrote a joint letter asserting that they had never encountered a faculty member who sought to impose communist beliefs on students in defending the faculty's right to teach. Still, Robert Hutchins was the central focus of the university's defense, and his tough-minded rhetoric in the face of such ludicrous charges and even more ludicrous testimony played well in the liberal media and afforded the university a central point of fame in national radio. Even before the Walgreens hearings opened, Hutchins went on the offensive, delivered a remarkable address on NBC Radio on the subject of what is a university. And this is a speech that actually lays out to I think, a rather broad general public the idea of not only what a university was, but why academic freedom was important. And this is an era when the latter concept was not well understood. Behind the scenes, however, the matters were more complex. The Board of Trustees was very divided about what was happening. They felt embarrassed by these accusations. Many of the board were particularly angry with Hutchins for having allowed the university to get in this situation to begin with. A survey of local opinion undertaken quietly and confidentially by a fundraising kind of advisory service, the John Price Jones Corporation, in April of 1936, in preparation of a new capital campaign the university was intending to launch, found that the university's image actually had been tarnished by these charges. They found, quote, there was widespread feeling among certain elements of the Chicago banking and commercial elite that the university is unjustifiably stirring up discontent and has been insufficiently diligent in controlling such discontent. The point is that it was well and good to give radio addresses and well and good to mock Mrs. Dilling or Mrs. Dillinger, you take your pick. But in fact, the defense of academic freedom, the very aggressive defense of academic freedom that Hutchins launched, sustained, actually hurt the university in terms of its financial contributions from conservative elites in the city. The second episode I want to mention briefly involves a similar transaction. In the aftermath of wartime hostilities in August of 1945, new challenges emerged on the horizon involving, again, direct allegations of communism on our campus, and this time in the very tense confluence of fear and paranoia that's been codified as the era of McCarthyism. In June of 1947, the Illinois General Assembly approved legislation creating another special public commission to investigate seditious activities on the campuses of all of the universities. This was a commission that was created in the time of fear about communism that was sweeping American society. It was chaired by, a small town rural senator from Mount Vernon, Illinois, Paul Broyles. It came to be called the Broyles Commission. Broyles had made a fortune selling photo enlargements to Illinois farmers in the Depression era. In response to an invitation of the Broyles Commission to testify, university notables were forced to journey to Springfield in late April 1948. Hutchins testified on April 21st, and he performed brilliantly, combining moral outrage with utter and mordant disdain for what was going on. In his opening remarks, he condemned the usual tactic employed by professional red baiters, guilt by association, and insisted that the danger to our institution is not from any tiny minority who do not believe in them. It is from those who would mistakenly repress the free spirit upon which these institutions are built. The miasma of thought control that is now spreading across the country, Hutchins continued, is the greatest menace to the United States since Hitler. And there's wonderful stories. Don't have time to go into them. There's this one moment when Hutchins is being interrogated by a professional red baiter who the committee had hired as their agent, a guy named J.B. Matthews, who accused a professor of biology, Maud Sly, of having indoctrinated people in her lab. It turned out that the only other living organisms in Maud Sly's lab, aside from Maud Sly, were mice. And so Matthews asked, may I ask if it's in your educational theory, is there not such a thing as indoctrination by example? To which Hutchins replied, of mice? More telling, however, than Hutchins' defense of Maud Sly and her indoctrinated mice was his emphatic statement that unlike the administration of the University of Washington, which had recently fired 3 faculty members for alleged communist sympathies, the University of Chicago would reject any such policy. As Ellen Schrecker, the author of No Ivory Tower, has demonstrated, the Washington case sent shockwaves through the American Academy. Schrecker observes, in considering Hutchins' stance during the Broyles affair, that, quote, had other academic leaders been as outspoken as Hutchins in opposing off-campus investigations, they might have mitigated the damage. And as was the case in 1935, the campus pulled together, students and faculty alike finding themselves in the happy situation of being on the same side of a highly controversial issue. Schrecker has speculated that the University of Chicago was able to weather crises like the Walgreens affair and the Broyles affair better because we had, quote, a uniquely independent and cohesive institution. This cohesiveness, now I come to my third case, was, however, something of an illusion. I think this is demonstrated by a little-known incident that rocked the university in 1944, so it's between the Walgreens and Broyles cases, involving a collision between Hutchins and the senior faculty over faculty rights. In 1944, a large number of senior faculty signed a protest petition to the Board of Trustees against several statements made by Robert Hutchins in which he called for the university to crusade, quote, to crusade for the creation of, quote, a moral, intellectual, and spiritual revolution throughout the world, end quote. Denouncing the inherent conservatism of the faculty that he characterized as that of a well-intentioned turtle, Hutchins proposed to achieve this revolution by eliminating academic rank, eliminating the course credit system, creating new structures to award special doctorates for teachers in the liberal arts that would be outside the academic departments, and authorizing the president to put in radical new educational policies without the approval of the Senate and subject only to no confidence votes of the whole faculty. Drafted in April of 1944 by Professor Ronald Crane and others, the so-called Memorial to the Board of Trustees and the State of the University challenged Hutchins' style of governance as president and his clear patent interest in weakening the power and authority of the departments. And although couched as a protest against Hutchins' seemingly dangerous ideas relating to graduate education, the memorial was in fact a declaration of faculty rights against a putative tyrant who was seen as threatening faculty prerogatives. The memorial also provided a strong statement of the importance of ethical and political neutrality for the university as an institution, insisting that the university could continue to prosper intellectually if, quote, it is committed, it could not, if it's committed to any particular social, moral, philosophical, or spiritual ideology or specific foundation of unity, end quote. The Crane Memorial was thus a fascinating exercise in claims about rights. If Hutchins were allowed to implement his plans, the faculty feared, quote, the further progress and healthy functioning of the university in a free democratic world, end quote, might be compromised. Universities as bundles of faculty prerogative became, in this scenario, agents that might assist the development of democratic freedom throughout the world. This collision between Hutchins and the faculty happened for two reasons. The first was Hutchins' conception of presidential leadership, which was bold, interventionist, and highly plebiscitary. Hutchins was willing to defend the faculty against the hostile world, Mrs. Dillinger and company, but he also thought that universities could and should act radically under the leadership of a strong president within that world. Second reason involved the acceleration, what I would call the acceleration and intensification of conceptions of corporate rights that is part and parcel of the history of faculty prerogative within the history of the modern university. Much like the Parlement of Paris in the 1770s and 1780s, defending collective presumptions about historic rights that blended individual advantage with group authority, solidarity, and prerogative, the faculty protests of 1944 were undertaken by a body acting in defense of a privileged community of rights. To lose one's corporate rights within this privileged community, where it was as bad or worse as losing one's individual rights to some external force, such as the government, the general public. Even though the faculty were willing, even eager to see the president defend their individual rights against external nefarious forces, such as the Illinois General Assembly or the Hearst newspapers, they advocated a richer and denser self-conception as collective and corporate bearers of rights and privileges within the university, in the context of which the revolutionary educational ideals of a strong visionary president were threatening. The memorial of 1944 was thus a worthy ancestor of the Calvin Report of 1967, which enshrines this notion of a privileged corporation that declares itself as being a kind of realm of negative liberty, one that should not involve itself in outside causes so that each individual member of the community can speak his or her own will. The Calvin Report thus blends both intellectual streams of the three episodes I've mentioned, the rights of individual faculty and students to engage in controversy, and the collective right of the university as a community to abstain from controversy that Chicago experienced in the 1930s and 1940s. This, too, is an exercise of rights, and it was all the more apparent in the stunning fact that the Calvin Report was formulated without any input from or consultation with the university's Board of Trustees. Now, one scholar, and this is my final comment, who was involved in all three of these episodes about faculty rights, was Professor Richard McKeon. McKeon was a classical scholar and a philosopher, a student of the philosophy of history, who served as dean of the Division of Humanities from 1935 to 1947. McKeon deeply admired Hutchins' trenchant defense of academic freedom, and in his subsequent autobiography credits Hutchins with having an important impact on his professional career. McKeon was thus well suited for the role that he came to play in connecting the University of Chicago somewhat tangentially, but I think significantly, to the Universal Declaration. In 1947, Hutchins served as a lead organizer and public rapporteur of the UNESCO Committee of Experts on the Philosophical Principles of the Rights of Man that met in Paris in late June and early July of 1947 and commissioned various analytic surveys of human rights that were eventually circulated to the actual commission, the drafting commission, at the same time was working on the Declaration. Nor was McKeon the only member of this committee of experts who had a Chicago connection, for the volume of essays that was finally published by the committee was introduced by Professor Jacques Maritain, whom Hutchins had tried to recruit to the Chicago faculty in the early 1940s. It also included essays from people like Quincy Wright of the university. The influence that the McKeon project had on the Universal Declaration's drafting commission has been much debated. But among the many threads leading into the Declaration itself, McKeon later insisted that, quote, the growth of universities and the diversification of higher education focused on action needed to free men from unwarranted interference with his thought or expression. McKeon's commentary on the project of a Universal Declaration of Human Rights is thus anchored in the presumption of the importance of higher education as a venue for and path to a culture that respects rights, which he presupposes a condition for the implementation of the regime of rights articulated in the Declaration. I think it's also important to remember that of the 8 members of the UNESCO Committee of Experts, 6 were senior university professors, and the aura of their work and what one might call the conditions of their discursive practices were inevitably linked to the world of the university. The Viennese composer Arnold Schoenberg, they wrote around asking for opinions on rights to whole numbers of people, and Schoenberg for some reason ended up on the list and actually wrote something. Arnold Schoenberg, who was invited to submit an opinion to the Committee of Experts, caught this aura of university-based legitimacy and professionalism well when he wrote, I think somewhat tongue-in-cheek, to McKeon that, quote, I am conscious of the difference in style of this paper, he's talking about his own paper, with the scientific dignity required on such occasions. But though I was a university professor myself, I did not cease to remain a musician, a composer of music, and I cannot but consider humor an important human right. This charming transaction between McKeon and Schoenberg reminds us, it seems to me, of the corporate role of universities in the wider world of rights, and it is perhaps not accidental that McKeon's solicitation of expert views was substantially directed to academics, not simply as autonomous thinkers, but as professional colleagues having the legitimacy of a specific institutional matrix, namely micro-communities of university freedom. In sum, to conclude, our university had a number of fascinating, really quite fascinating opportunities to successfully claim rights, as well as to defend and to practice rights over the course of the middle third of the 20th century. In different ways, both Robert Hutchins and Richard McKeon believed that the modern university could and should play a unique role in the exercise of rights, making it, I think, an appropriate and robust sponsor of a discourse of rights that might find pragmatic ways to embed itself in the broader terrain of civil society. Thank you very much.
Hi, good afternoon. I want to thank Michael and Susan and Mark for inviting me to participate in today's celebration. And unfortunately, I've reached the stage in my life where I can either see my text or you, so I'm going to go with the text. In 1948, the year of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, racially restrictive marriage laws limited the domestic possibilities of Americans in 30 of 48 states. That year, California became the first state since Reconstruction in the end of the 19th century to rule an anti-miscegenation law, as they were known, unconstitutional, ruling that marriage was a fundamental right that could not be regulated according to race under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. The decision in Perez v. Sharp which was cited last May as precedent for California's landmark gay marriage decision, the one that was only 2 weeks ago rendered nullified through a constitutional amendment, also cited the United Nations Charter, which had been ratified by the U.S. as a treaty in 1946, and which, as you know, prohibited all forms of racial discrimination. The California Supreme Court citation of the UN Charter was celebrated by African Americans who viewed the UN as a potential tool of liberation in domestic politics. Many white Americans, particularly but not exclusively Southerners, also recognized the potential of international law to shape domestic law. In the 5 years following the Paris decision, champions of local sovereignty used the decision to illustrate the danger that human rights norms posed to racial conventions in the United States and triggered a debate about the peril of international law that resulted in an effort to amend the U.S. Constitution and limit the treaty-making power of the President. At the same time, champions of racial equality in America called on international law to buttress their own liberal interpretations of the Constitution in defense of human and civil rights. The distance between universalistic American goals and discriminatory American practices, between all men are created equal and the nation's intricate system of legal discrimination by race, had long left the United States vulnerable to charges of hypocrisy by its own citizens and outsiders alike. Restrictive marriage statutes were not the most prominent racially discriminatory laws in America or a favorite target of the foreign press, which tended to highlight segregated public accommodations, disenfranchisement, and racial violence. But because the Human Rights Commission, which drafted the Universal Declaration, included freedom of marriage on their list of fundamental human rights in Article 16, America's anti-miscegenation laws provided a sturdy platform from which to launch accusations of hypocrisy and to discredit Western democracy. Because the Human Rights Commission linked freedom of marriage to citizenship rights and state membership, it was easy for America's antagonists to portray anti-miscegenation laws as emblematic of the broader Jim Crow racial regime and to use them as shorthand for a critique of the United States as a whole. It was equally easy for defenders of America's racial status quo to consider both Article 16 and the United Nations in general a serious threat to the South's segregated society. After 1948, what had previously been contemned by supporters of African American civil rights as a violation of American ideals was liable to be indicted as human rights abuse. Now, whereas a significant cadre of American foreign policy analysts after World War II, considered American race relations dangerous for the nation's new role in global politics, the guardians of Jim Crow considered American participation in international organizations such as the United Nations a threat to the established social order. The danger to the sovereign status quo lay in the interpretive possibilities of the UDHR and especially the UN Charter in its relationship to American law. Howard University Law School Dean and NAACP lawyer William H. Hastie argued already in a 1946 challenge to segregated interstate transportation that when the U.S. had ratified the UN Charter, America had, quote, embedded in its national policy a prohibition against racism and pledged itself to respect fundamental freedoms for all without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion. This position was reinforced in 1948. As the Human Rights Commission released the Universal Declaration, California annulled its restrictive marriage laws, and 4 justices of the United States Supreme Court included references to the UN Charter in an opinion overturning some of California's alien land laws. In 1950, the California District State Court of Appeals in Los Angeles found the remaining restrictions on alien ownership of land unconstitutional on the grounds that they conflicted with the Universal Declaration and the UN Charter, which, as Mark Bradley told you earlier, they ruled as a federal treaty prevailed over state law. In a unanimous decision in Seifuji v. California, Justice Emmett H. Wilson explained that when the U.S. ratified the Charter in 1946, it pledged to uphold the opinions expressed in the Charter, including racial equality. The district court's subservience to the Charter decision, as it was known, was quickly undone by the California Supreme Court under duress, but it was too late. The appellate decision caused an immediate uproar. It also received an extraordinary amount of attention in the nation's leading law journals, where scholars debated the finer points of treaty law and the relevance of the UN Charter to racially discriminatory state legislation. The New York Times predicted a national crisis should the California rulings be sustained. Fortunately, it was not, so we were spared that. By the time that the president of the Conservative American Bar Association, which was also racially discriminatory, pointed out that the 1948 decision overturning California's anti-miscegenation laws had rested in part on the Charter, the ground was well tilled for the argument that the United Nations posed the greatest threat to states' rights since the Army of the Potomac. The majority decision in the California anti-miscegenation case, Paris v. Sharp, did not mention the UN Charter. It was mentioned in a concurring opinion instead. This didn't prevent opponents of American adherence to international standards of human rights from associating the Charter and the Universal Declaration with the Paris decision, or discourage them from suggesting that judges, by respecting treaties as the supreme law of the land, could effect domestic social reform without the participation and against the wishes of state and federal legislatures. By empowering judges, federal treaties to the Constitution threatened majoritarian rule. However far-fetched some of the interpretations of the effect of the Seifuji decision, such things as Russians would buy up all of California, or that Africans would write the laws that govern white men's family life, those are exact words, the question of the relationship of the UN Charter and the Universal Declaration to American law was momentous. A leading expert in international law, University of Chicago political scientist Quincy Wright, argued that although it carried no binding obligations, the Universal Declaration was, quote, an authoritative interpretation of the words human rights and fundamental freedoms in Articles 55 and 56 of the Charter, and that it was the duty of judges to refuse to apply laws that violated observance of human rights. As for state sovereignty, Wright concluded that enforcing the human rights and fundamental freedoms of the UN Charter was a mere variation of the way that, as he put it, American courts, in applying the 14th Amendment, have done much to achieve respect for and observance of constitutional guarantees within the states of the Union. Little could be done about the 14th Amendment at this late date, but in 1952, the ABA president, Frank Holman, who pops up over and over again in stories about the Universal Declaration, he teamed up with Ohio Senator John Brickner to severely constrain the treaty-making powers of the president. The timing was not insignificant, and it wasn't unrelated to recent interpretations of the 14th Amendment. In 1950, to give only one example, the Supreme Court undermined the separate but equal rule in higher education and in transportation in 3 unanimous opinions. Under the terms of the Bricker Amendment, treaties had to be passed by the House of Representatives, as well as the Senate, and ratified by 2/3 of state legislatures. This populist move was designed to insulate cherished local social institutions, such as segregated schools and restrictive marriage laws. Once it became clear that the Bricker Amendment had some traction, the Eisenhower administration acted forcefully against it, but not without first promising that the U.S. would not ratify any UN human rights treaties, such as the pending Genocide Convention. As Secretary of State John Foster Dulles explained, quote, "We do not ourselves look upon a treaty as a means which we would now select as the proper and most effective way to spread throughout the world the goods of human liberty." So by 1950, as we've seen, there was an established constitutional logic in the courts of the United States, admittedly only in California, as well as an articulated international logic of human rights that treated the complete dismantling of racially discriminatory regimes, including the abolition of anti-miscegenation laws, as normative. Yet neither the Paris decision nor the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or the UN Charter had demonstrable effect on race-based prohibitions on marriage in the United States. Anti-miscegenation laws were never challenged on a mass level, nor were they of special interest to the NAACP, Congress, or the executive. Only in 1967 would the Supreme Court declare such laws unconstitutional, in its only civil rights decision ever to appeal to fundamental principles of vital personal rights. Although victorious in the long term, by 1950, both the constitutional logic of heterosexual marriage as a civil right protected by the 14th Amendment and the argument that international human rights norms might trump discriminatory local practices had outpaced the domestic political will to support these rights and had instead inspired strenuous resistance, as demonstrated by the Bricker Amendment and a mounting rhetoric of local sovereignty and states' rights. In addition to the domestic cost of delaying the destruction of Jim Crow, there was an international price to this resistance. American stigmatization of international human rights norms and treaties was rooted directly in its civil rights struggle and reflected the potential of international organizations to assault domestic racial conventions at their foundations. The speed with which the two-pronged threat of the constitutional and international logics of individual human rights merged in the minds of Dixie's defenders is apparent from the billboards that sprang up alongside Southern highways after the Brown decision was announced in 1954 and that were still there as late as the 1980s. And some of you may have seen these. These were big billboards divided in two, and on one side it read, "Impeach Earl Warren," and on the other side it said, "U.S. out of UN." What I would like to argue for you today is that far from representing the ideological idiosyncrasies, no wonder I can't say that, ideological idiosyncrasies of the far-right nutcases, these sentiments were tied together both logically and pragmatically. Thanks.
Well, I'd also like to thank Michael and Susan and Mark, and would like to apologize in advance for being still stuck a little bit in the University of Chicago mode, which involves raising the inevitable negative and critical aspects of human rights. But I promise that that's not the only story. There's another half to it. The unavoidable fact is, however, that any account of human rights in U.S. history must necessarily be one filled with disappointment and regret. The soaring aspirations unleashed by the bold language of the UDHR and its precursor, the UN Charter, are matched, maybe even outmatched, by the dashed hopes of those who hoped to realize their ideals at home and abroad. And deep flaws worked their way into the post-war human rights regime at its very founding and cannot be separated out or explained away. What I'd like to do today is suggest that the tendency to look at the human rights regime more generally erected in this period has been warped by our tendency to think of it either through the idealist lens of human rights or through the realist lens of realpolitik, and I think, in fact, we need to merge the two. First, though, we'll start with the limitations. At Yalta in February of 1945, when the Allied powers agreed to establish a collective security organization, the President of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt, assented to Soviet designs on the Baltic nations as a security perimeter, and this agreement would make a mockery of the principle of self-determination right at the very founding moment. When the delegates began to meet in San Francisco in late April and May of 1945 to prepare the way for drafting and signing the UN Charter, the B-29s under Curtis LeMay's command were still busy firebombing the cities of Japan, killing hundreds of thousands and rendering a quarter of the urban civilian population homeless. The issuance of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in December of 1948 took place against the backdrop of the Berlin airlift, begun a half a year earlier, which cemented the Truman Doctrine's unilateral commitment to lend support to the free peoples of the world struggling against communism. Over the course of the next 2 decades, this policy of containment, of global containment, would lead the United States to provide vital military aid and diplomatic support to anti-communist dictatorships around the world. And the disappointments applied at home as well as abroad. In the year leading up to the UDHR, the NAACP petitioned the UN with an appeal to the world, written by none other than W.B. Du Bois, which urged the UN to redress the human rights violations that were a regular feature of race relations in the United States. The NAACP had reason to be hopeful. Eleanor Roosevelt had just joined its board of directors and was chair of the UN's Commission on Human Rights. However, Roosevelt was cool to Du Bois and to the NAACP. She worried that the appeal would provoke the forces of reaction and destroy the work of the Commission. In the end, the UDHR simply urged the adoption of its dream list of rights, but offered nothing in the way of enforcement, a cold comfort indeed for Du Bois and the NAACP. Within a very short period of time, it became clear that Eleanor Roosevelt's sense of caution was warranted. Conservative alarm about America's involvement in the UN rose sharply in the last years of the 1940s, aroused in part by Truman's Civil Rights Commission and the activities of some of the people that Jane talked about. The Commission observed in 1947, for example, that as a consequence of signing the UN Charter, the federal government was empowered to enforce rights specified therein. Conservative alarm spiked with the issuance of the UDHR and with the UN General Assembly's approval of the Genocide Convention of 1948. Civil rights groups on the left quickly seized this opening, most notably in the Civil Rights Congress's petition, We Charge Genocide, in November of 1951. This, of course, drove Southern Democrats and other conservatives to distraction, obsessed as they already were with protecting state sovereignty from purely domestic threats. When the Republicans took back the presidency and both houses of Congress in the elections of 1952, the lines of communication and institutional support that had been cultivated by Eleanor Roosevelt and her allies within the Truman administration were abruptly cut, and the conservative voices that had vehemently been criticizing American foreign aid and involvement in the UN throughout the late 1940s seized their moment of opportunity. It was in this context that Senator John Bricker of Ohio pressed his advantage, introducing an amendment that would insulate the sovereignty of the United States. It was not enough for Bricker and his allies that Article 2, Section 7 of the UN Charter dodged the whole question of sovereignty, leaving questions of domestic jurisdiction unchallenged, as Mark Bradley discussed. Under Article 6, Clause 2 of the U.S. Constitution, treaties were, quote, the supreme law of the land. This concerned Bricker and his allies. To address this, the Bricker Amendment prohibited the signing of treaties without congressional regulation of all executive agreements. And Jane mentioned how thorough the congressional check was on those agreements. But furthermore, particular provisions within treaties would be invalid if they conflicted with the Constitution, and they would be effective only after Congress had passed specific laws enabling those provisions, positive law, in other words, and that would also have to be constitutionally valid law. So if struck down, those provisions would no longer apply. It was easy to write Bricker off as a throwback. He was a Midwestern Republican aligned with the isolationist faction that was already doomed to extinction with the rise of Eisenhower within the Republican Party. And many at the time did, in fact, write him off. In fact, the political journalist and University of Chicago alumnus, John Gunther, wrote that Bricker's mind was, quote, like interstellar space, a vast vacuum occasionally crossed by homeless, wandering cliches. Even Robert Taft, the senior senator from Ohio, had his doubts. But Bricker had some impressive friends. Frank Holman, president of the American Bar Association, and the real intellectual force behind the amendment, had attacked the UDHR in early 1949, saying it was written on, quote, pink paper, and warning that it would promote state socialism, if not communism, throughout the world. By 1952, Holman was warning the sons of the American Revolution that the UN threatened the very foundations of the Republic. In 1953, more than 60 senators were co-sponsors of the Bricker Amendment in the Senate. But when put to a vote in February of 1954, it fell short of the necessary two-thirds majority by a margin of only one vote. Now, while it's possible to underestimate Bricker, it's also possible to overstate what he represented and to dismiss the real changes in American statecraft that were wrought by mid-century internationalism. And here, I really think, we don't have time to go into it, but I'd be happy to discuss it in the discussion period. I really think our literature suffers from a tendency to bracket idealism and realism, human rights and realpolitik, to treat them as opposites, when in fact, I think a different approach might make more sense. Although, of course, there are always scenarios in which they are opposites. Even after the nadir of internationalism marked by the Bricker Amendment, the United States did not abandon the United Nations, at least not in the 20th century. It retained the leading role it had initially assumed on the Security Council, in the IMF, and in the World Bank. Consider the viewpoint of Eisenhower, not known as a great champion of human rights, or certainly not one of the heroes. But consider his opposition, which killed Bricker's amendment before it could leave Congress. Then in 1955, after the amendment was dead, but also after his Secretary of State made clear that the U.S. would not sign on to the Genocide Convention, nor would it sign on to the Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, Eisenhower nonetheless stated, quote, with all the defects, with all the failures that we can check up against it, the UN still represents man's best organized hope to substitute the conference table for the battlefield. Eisenhower was no starry-eyed New Dealer. As the Supreme Allied Commander of Operation Overlord, and later of NATO, he had practical experience with collective security, even if only of the asymmetrical variety, and he knew well the military value of that collective security. In other words, the national interest in realist terms. The international commitments that Eisenhower helped implement marked a profound departure from long-standing patterns of American political development. It required membership in world government, no matter how protean, entangling alliances, a permanent defense establishment and a large army, peacetime conscription that lasted for generations, mass taxation to fund vast defense spending. This is what Bricker was afraid of as well, and there was a vibrant debate among conservatives over whether or not the United States should, in fact, embrace even unilateral internationalism in the late 1940s. If we're looking for either realism or human rights, then these shifts were simply the price of national security in a dangerous age. But what if one thinks of human rights as a perfection of sovereignty, especially American popular sovereignty, forged in the late Enlightenment glow of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution? If we do this, instead of viewing human rights only and always as a limitation on sovereignty, then the international commitments look different, I would argue. Consider the American occupation and reconstruction of Japan and Germany. There's no question that both were implemented in a manner that always sought American advantage and interest. The Nuremberg trials notwithstanding, occupation forces chose to work with ex-Nazis to establish law and order, and in the longer term, to bring about economic recovery. And early on in his career, Henry Kissinger played an important role in establishing that law and order, and maybe learned something about realism in the process. In Japan, MacArthur's command operated on patronizing principles that John Dower has likened to the last stand of the white man's burden. Emperor Hirohito, perhaps the greatest war criminal of all in Japan, was protected from prosecution in the Tokyo War trials because the Supreme Allied Command deemed him necessary to sustain its rule, and Dower has argued that this may have done more than anything else to provide a corrosive cynicism about the war trials themselves. Both occupations were conducted among peoples demonized only months earlier during the war as racially or ideologically intolerable. Witness the firebombing of both countries and the detonation of an atomic bomb over 2 cities in Japan. And yet, in both occupations, the U.S. expended extraordinary manpower, treasure, and legitimacy in an effort to permanently remake both societies. That this reconstruction was increasingly pursued to create anti-communist bulwarks does not detract from the real human rights consequences that both produced. Between 1945 and 1947, international spending as a proportion of the U.S. budget jumped from 2 to almost 17%. This was after the war had been won and American national interest had been realized, but before the vast spending on the Marshall Plan was able to begin in earnest. Once the Marshall Plan aid kicked in, it remained at roughly 16% for 2 years, and then by 1952 had ratcheted down to about between 2 and 4%, where it remained for most of the post-war period up to the Nixon administration, which was still dramatically higher than it had been the case before the war. Tens of thousands of U.S. troops, 250,000 in Japan alone, remained stationed overseas despite an extraordinary demand to bring the boys back home. This was almost unimaginable for a nation that only a few years earlier had seen widespread opposition to any involvement whatsoever in World War II. And despite the many pernicious results of Japanese and German reconstruction, both societies nonetheless became committed to democracy, even after years of the severest regimentation that fascist government could produce. And this is really very vividly brought home in Dower's book. Both fostered demilitarization and the embrace of peace as core values within the two great powers that had previously been among the world's most egregious serial aggressors. Both inculcated civil societies that flourished and even outdid the U.S. in some of its commitments to international cooperation and human rights. I want to be careful here in using these two examples. Again, I'm happy to discuss this afterwards in the Q&A. Both examples have been abused recently for political reasons, for polemical reasons, but I don't think that they should then be abandoned to polemics. Liberal internationalism, in conclusion, had political legs domestically, real political legs, and so directed a major investment of precious post-war resources. Why? Because it pursued what was a pressing, pragmatic, realistic goal in the 1940s, that is to say, peace. Polls from the late 1940s show that Americans believed that World War III was imminent throughout much of the late 40s and into the 1950s. And as a consequence, most Americans heartily embraced international cooperation to a surprising degree if you look at the various measures that are supported, but primarily as a means to prevent global war. Now, I don't want to overstate my case. The emphasis on peace among the great powers came at a grave cost. True enough, the U.S. never fought the Soviets or the Chinese directly, although they came close in Korea and Vietnam. But fatefully, the developing world, that is to say, most of humanity, was strong-armed by Cold War geopolitics precisely at the foundational moment when the colonial order collapsed in self-determination, that most venerable of human rights, was supposed to begin. Still, and this is the key, there never was a third world war, knock on wood, and its possibility was quite imminent in many scenarios throughout the post-war period. Try to imagine what the conditions of human rights around the world would have been if such a war had occurred. Was this because of the UN, or as the realists might argue, in spite of it? And that's too large a question to deal with here at the end of my talk. But I would suggest that the demilitarization of both Germany and Japan had something to do with it. And further, as we've seen in recent years, the abandonment of the UN can be extraordinarily destabilizing, even in a supposedly unipolar world. So just imagine how destabilizing it would have been not to have had a UN in the bipolar competition of the post-war period. These observations alone would suggest that the international commitments of the mid-20th century did indeed make a critical difference for all their many shortcomings.
One of the things that comes up a lot in the Declaration, but in an American context never emerges in discourse all that much, is that the Declaration is as much about rights as it is about duties. And there's quite a sort of, the way in which it's structured in many ways is about the sort of complementarities of this kind of thing. But as you see, as people are talking about academic freedom, does the issue of the duties that come with those rights move into that discourse in particular ways? Or similarly, for Jane and Jim, to what extent do duties seem to be at all in the mix as far as Americans are apprehending what this rights language might be? People often say this is a kind of European or Latin American construction that doesn't really emerge in American domestic space in that period of time. But I'm curious if you see echoes of it in any of these cases, particularly in the university cases, I guess. I think they're out.
Is this live? I think that's a valid question. I think you have to remember, though, that at our university, and I think it's probably the case at most of the other universities that got caught up in these kinds of scandals and controversies, it was usually generated by some exterior body or exterior force putting the faculty on the defensive. And so you ended up with these kinds of really almost show trials, the kind of somewhat humorous, actually they're rather very humorous episodes that I read from the Walgreens debates. The actual debates are in stenographic protocols over in the library. I would invite, if you are bored one afternoon, you can just go over. It's actually kind of a comedy show for they're laughing for all of their kind of absurdities. There's a picture of Hutchins having to listen to these people kind of denounce them, and it's kind of like he had put on 4 or 5 years on his face just having to listen to these idiocies. But the idea of what one did with one's freedom, one found oneself defending against such a fundamental lack of knowledge, not only of what the academic freedom was, but what the university was. And so that the Hutchins at his best did not really begin to say, I'm a professor or you're a student, you have freedom, but rather to talk about more generally about what university community was. And actually that's really what comes through in a much more eloquent way in both the Broyles Commission debates and in the Walgreens hearings. And it's that really, I think, quite justifiably, for which he then becomes known as a rhetorician, not as a kind of First Amendment lawyer for academics who are in trouble with the law, and people were in trouble with the law in the 1940s and 50s, but rather as a very eloquent defender of a conception of the university in which the freedom was one central element to the prosecution of our central mission as an educational community.
I would actually say that in the case of the material I'm working on, duties do actually come up in the origins of the U.S. rights revolution, which occurs in tandem with this human rights revolution that we're talking about, and the two are clearly intertwined. And you see it most clearly in the GI Bill of Rights, which creates a sort of first-class citizenship in which the white men are able to claim the sorts of rights that the Europeans get in the social democracies, the post-war social democracies. The right to health care, to housing, to education, unemployment benefits, a whole slew of rights. And the category of the veteran is extraordinarily powerful, and so that you see in the immediate post-war period, when there's an outbreak of voter registration drives in the South in 1946, which are summarily crushed, before they're crushed are led by veterans returning home. And it's a really frightening development for many of these Southerners who see in the downfall of Bilbo and the rise of the Fair Employment Practices Commission a real threat to their sovereignty. And a lot of the states' rights rhetoric of the 1948 election, in which the Dixiecrats campaign against, bolt against the Democratic Party that Southern Democrats had been in since the Civil War, was about this threat that had everything to do with the potential overriding of national categories over local categories, national power over local. And nothing was more threatening in some ways than the veteran. John Gunther wrote that all of the lynching cases that he had come to know about in the post-war period were lynchings of veterans. So what this all points to is the incredible moral power of the category of the veteran, because they had realized their duties in the most unquestionable way. I would call it the soldier becomes a sort of culture hero at the center of national political culture. What this does is, on the one hand, it draws a circle not just around Americans, which is inimical to certain kinds of human rights, but it draws a circle around white men. At the same time, it creates a category that ultimately enables women, as they begin to serve later on, to make claims. And we see that playing out even today. I would say it's universalistic, but not universal, this commitment to the nation that's demonstrated in military service. And I think it demonstrates how sovereignty can be aligned with rights that often can reinforce a sort of nationalism that's inimical to human rights, but can also have a disruptive potential that can eventually be used as a sort of lever.
Just quickly on the subject of African American veterans and GI benefits, many African American veterans do get GI benefits, but interestingly, they have to move to get them. So in other words, they move to California when they come back, because they can get them in California, they can't get them in Mississippi. Some of them get them in Mississippi, but you see this movement of African American populations around the United States generated in part by a desire for access principally to public education, which California had really the best public university system in the country at that time. Your question about templates for the Declaration, one of the interesting things to me as I started to learn about this was how many templates there were, and how early people started making their templates for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as early as 1942. Groups are forming to try and figure this out. And one of the most important ones was put together by the American Law Institute, which is an elite organization of jurists and law professors, basically. And they came up with one that had so many positive rights in it that they were actually disowned by their own organization when they presented it, because they had a huge fight then at their meeting about whether or not it could have positive rights or duties, or if it had to be only negative rights. And the position of the people who drafted it was that at this late date, in other words, in 1943, it was laughable to have a conception of rights that was limited to negative rights. And they had all sorts of duties and positive rights in it. So I think, yes, it's not just pressure from Latin American states. One of the things that's interesting about the American Law Institute's drafting group is that it was an international group. So if you want to say, did Americans contribute to this? Yes, it wasn't just, say, Latin America, but when you look then at the ALI, they've got all major religions, as many countries as they want, men and women, et cetera, et cetera. They were trying seriously to come up with a universal iteration of rights. So that was at least one American example of incorporation of positive rights.
Hi. I was just wondering if you could clarify the concept of a human rights regime, as I think that would help, well, for people who are not particularly familiar with it, would help to bring out the significance of the declaration itself. My intuition is that it's something like a set of discourses used for claims making by public, private, and civil society actors in national and international context, and a set of formal and informal mechanisms in politics and law, also in national and international context. Is that roughly it, or how do you understand that notion? Because it seems to be like the big central concept, but it's kind of unclear for me.
It seems like a very good start on a definition to me. You guys, is this coming to me?
Yeah.
All right. I think it's a great question. Second, it's a great start in trying to answer it. But let me explain why it seems to me that it's a great question. And that's that I don't think it's at all clear what human rights are in that kind of sense. And I don't mean in a definitional sense, what the articles of the Declaration are and that sort of thing. But whether we're talking about a kind of imaginary that's out there that people are using at particular times to make claims, or whether we're talking about some sort of emergent legal regime. And in fact, at this moment, it seems to me it's both. And the definitions that you were talking about speak to both of those dimensions of it. But it comes back to me to this notion of a kind of believability, right? Because even if there is, the legal ground is shaky on all of this, it seems to me, in many ways. I mean, I don't know where the International Criminal Court will go over time, but coming into it, it's always, these kinds of ad hoc decisions that Jane was talking about and Jim was talking about to a certain degree seem to characterize, to me, where really international law in an on-the-ground kind of way goes in these kinds of matters, so that there's no kind of settled way of thinking about that, which then keeps coming back to the notion that there is some sort of imaginary out there that can become appealing in particular times, in particular places to people. And the question, I think, becomes a situated question of in what places, at what times, and how. And in thinking about this panel, where we're focused more on a kind of American dimension of all of this, I think the thing to be very aware of is, Jane's right, it's not just the Latin American actors who do this, that, and the other, and I don't mean to suggest it that way, but I do mean to suggest that from an American standpoint, there is a kind of sense about, it's all about us, right? And when the moment comes, actually, in the 1970s, the way in which that moment has generally been narrated, really until the last, I don't know, 10-odd years, it was the Carter moment, right? Jimmy Carter suddenly, out of thin air, decided that human rights mattered again. Well, that turns out to be a really complicated story of how by 1976, 1977, he gets to that place, and in fact, why that resonates with people so directly. And I would say that the beginnings of an answer to that question have to really do with what's going on outside of the United States. And that it's actors from outside the United States, I think in part in this case Latin American actors, but I also think it's actors in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe who have found the language again and are using it to make claims at home and are also bringing that language back into an American context, which then gives it a certain amount of political life. There's a lot that would go there to try to figure out how you get from the one to the other. But I think it's important as Americans, as we think about these questions, to realize that we often think about them in especially insular ways. And that the impetus for, I think, much of this, in whichever of the moments of jumps and discontinuities you want to talk about, is just as much someplace else as it is here, despite a kind of story of, again, state heroes that would sort of privilege a set of actors, in the actual construction of it all.
It just often seems to play out it often seems to operate as a discursive resource in national political battles. For the Chile case, part of the way in which the political opposition actually gained legitimacy was by appealing both to the concept of human rights and to the fact that the Ford Foundation and Carter were supporting that sort of movement.
Can I just piggyback on this and say that in addition to having a kind of U.S.-centric orientation, there's the moment in which the Charter and the Declaration were adopted was also circumscribed by the experience of the war, and that really framed what human rights were for several decades. And in particular, what they were the things that the fascist powers had violated. And it was just a question of how liberal you were and how far down into society you were willing to probe in search of the sources of that tyranny. But in being defined against government tyranny, human rights then pose the problem of what organization of power is going to prevent that tyranny. You have the unique structure of the UN itself that poses all sorts of problems as the Cold War evolves. I think what I'm trying to work through now, and as indicated in this talk, is that in fact the strong state power, the sort of military power that was involved in the American reconstruction of Germany and Japan and its response more generally in the Cold War, was seen as part and parcel of the more idealist New Deal-like visions of human rights that the Americans brought to the table. So when we think of human rights, we think of the things that governments do against either individuals or groups that are oppressive. But what's under-theorized and underdeveloped is how, if sovereignty is the main organizing principle, state sovereignty is still the main organizing principle in world politics, how those rights will be realized against the state, but also through some kind of state. You look at the original textbook by Hans Morgenthau, Politics Among Nations in 1948. He's got the entire Charter of the United Nations laid out, but he reads it only in order to take apart how it can't work within national sovereignty as he's interpreting it in 1948. What's not considered is how it could, how in fact the exercise of national sovereignty could cement those institutions and those norms so they become essential to exercising power, which is exactly what happened in the reconstruction of Japan.
We need to. Susan says we need to move on, but join me in thanking John and Jane and Jim for 3